Vladimir Putin is often referred to as a modern-day Adolf Hitler, under whom Russia rose to its present excellence as a superpower. There are speculations about how Putin might be suffering from numerous physical health conditions and dementia, which is likely for someone his age. In sharp contrast to the consequences that his health conditions might bring, Vladimir recently passed a law that may keep him in office until 2036. But what would happen if Putin dies tomorrow? The consequences would be dreadful. In today's video, we've brought you a list of 20 worrying questions that Putin's death might raise. Question 20. What would it be like for the Russian population? 70% of the Russian population gets its news from television, which is heavily censored by the Putin administration. The internet too is censored, and only approved content that suits the Russian regime's motives makes its way to the people. To add more to the existing difficulties for the Russian population, the latest infamous Ukraine invasion by Russia has led many countries to shut their airspace to Russian flights, and some have even stopped their services for Russian nationals. Thus, for the general population of Russia, who are now basically trapped in their own country, Putin's death might prove as a sigh of relief. Question 19. Would things fall into the hands of the armed? According to Dr. Robert E. Burles Jr., a senior advisor for Russia and Eurasia at the Nuclear Threat Initiative, said Putin's pseudo-Cossacks might come into power and take arms in Russia. The pseudo-Cossacks fall somewhere between the officials and bandits, and their coming grabbing the power might incite violence against minorities they do not like, and ultimately chaos in the country. The group isn't much well-controlled, given their cryptic role. They could prove to be an armed militia that is funded by the government and doesn't have any specified portrayal that could be dangerous. There's also more than enough proof that the pseudo-Cossacks are attacking anti-Putin protests, essentially displaying where their alliance lies. Question 18. Who would take Russia's responsibility immediately after Putin's death? Now, we know keeping a position as strong as that of a president of a country like Russia wouldn't be sensible. It always becomes necessary that some force occupies the vacuum and lets the country sit in peace. Well, officially, if Vladimir Putin were to be dead tomorrow, the Prime Minister grants an interim term under Article 92 of the Russian Constitution. This would signal that it's now time to arrange elections for the election of a new head of state for a period of a maximum of 3 months in the event of death. This interim president would rule Russia for 90 days until the next election. In the present scenario, the most significant player in Russian politics that might take up this vacuum would be none other than the current Prime Minister, Mikhail Mishustin himself, who would take charge as Russia's interim president. This would be more than enough time for those closest to Putin to consolidate their power, which, indirectly, might throw chemical weapons and nuclear firepower into even more unstable hands. Question 17. Would the Security Council take up some power? In the death of the President of Russia, or in the event of his lack of capacity to fulfill his duties, presidential powers are temporarily transferred to the head of the government. According to the Russian Constitution, an election should be held within 90 days. The focus then shifts from the government to the Security Council, which then takes things in charge. This will automatically make the Security Council member the key number during the instability. Question 16. Does this mean a rocky Russian elite and regime? The Security Council members will try their best in ensuring a constitutional transfer of power to ensure stability in the country. However, no individual group can resort to unrightful ways or personal gain, and such a group of people can seize power unofficially. Secondly, the security agencies are so assorted that political control over one of them would not guarantee the rest maintaining peace. An elite class and a strong regime can't have a smooth run in such a case, leading to their collapse. Question 15. What would be the role of the stakeholders? If the Russian leader dies, some important decisions would be made by regime stakeholders. Stakeholders can be divided into 3 groups from the point of view of their leverage. The most influential group is certain Security Council members. These include the Prime Minister, security bloc leaders, and heads of certain corporations. The second group of stakeholders is closely related to the former, but the voices of this tier will be softer. This milieu comprises the head of the central bank, the head of the accounts chamber, and all the top 20 wealthiest people of Russia on the Forbes list. And the third group comprises influential political managers. These stakeholders are not to be taken lightly, as they hold the potential to hand over the power to someone who might not really serve the country, but would indirectly serve the stakeholders' gains. Question 14. What impact would it have on the country's decision-making mechanism? The decision-making mechanism will rapidly fall apart. If there'd be anyone whose views would be given importance, it would be the lower two tiers. Anyone below the third tier, including federal and regional administrations, will have to just nod in a yes to whatever is decided by the superior groups. It should be noted, however, that the most powerful administrators at the federal and regional levels have their patrons among the upper three tiers. This will ensure tranquility in the country as it would promote consensus. Question 13. What would be the media's role? Despite labels being put onto the media such as Kremlin media or Kremlin propaganda, which imply a high degree of consolidation, the real situation is not so plain. Russia is a country where the media houses work for the interests of their owners and have their own biographical and institutional ties to Putin. In an emergency, media holding owners will cater not only to the interests of political managers from the presidential administration, they will also be on their knees directly from the top tier of stakeholders. Question 12. Who would succeed then? After a detailed analysis, one can speculate that only Sobyanin, Kudrin, Shemezov, Shuvalov, and Medvedev can be consensus candidates. Clearly, a consensus cannot be reached over influential and frequently mentioned persons, such as Sechin, Ramzan Kadyrov, or Shogyu. The consensus successor must meet important criteria. He or she should be an A-class official with extensive knowledge of macroeconomics. They must be capable of representing Russia abroad. They must be completely loyal to Putin's legacy. They must be accepted by Putin's entire milieu. And they need to be electorally acceptable to at least 30% of voters, and in general, symbolize a stable continuation of Putin's policy. Obviously, during his lifetime, Putin can pass on power to a little-known aspiring politician, one of the young regional governors, just like Yeltsin made Putin his successor. However, in a crisis, this would be impossible. Question 11. What would the country's situation be post the president's death? Putin's death would follow nationwide mourning. All executive and legislative bodies would be involved. Similar to the demise of other leaders in authoritarian regimes, we will see key stakeholders on TV during the funeral, since they will use these events to present their solemnity regarding the matter. The 3 months before the new president takes charge would be occupied with the public assessment of Putin's rule. The friction between the stands of Russian views and the international ones will influence the successor's plan for his term. We speculate debates over which portion of Putin's reign should become the center of the new president's policies. Question 12. And what about the Kremlin coffers? The Kremlin's financial resources include the entire budget of the Russian Federation, a shadow reserve, Putin and his associates' pooled cash fund, and informal claims against wealthy owners. The transfer of power is primarily the transfer of control over the system of diversified investment managed by the Kremlin. Statistically speaking, it's about a record of who has access to Putin's earnings and who keeps what assets where. No one but the consensus candidates must have the right over those details. There is no guarantee assured that the money will be safe unless there is a legitimate heir authorized to handle it. It's easy to imagine conflicts of interest between FSBs, financial groups, individuals, and so on over the money. Putin's personal reserve fund exceeds everyone's estimations. Rough probabilities suggest anywhere around $800 to $1 trillion worth of Russian investments made across the globe. Although all of it is not Putin's wealth, the amount is mind-wobbling and can make many make claims over it. Question 11. Would the opposition stand a chance? The legitimacy of Russian opponents and their commitment to a peaceful opposition movement will lead to the decision to start a campaign once the elections are announced. The goal of Navalny and the other opposition groups would be to demand a fair election involving Navalny and a few other independent candidates. But by then, a successor would have already been decided by the Russian public. Perhaps officials will act even more resolutely than when Putin took over from Medvedev in 2008. No candidate is allowed to create a virtual threat in the second round. In addition, this would be done with a huge safety margin. Only 3 very unpopular candidates would be able to enter. Question 10. Can a Putin 2.0 be the country's next autocrat? After Putin's death, there are also changes in an alternate scenario that those who'd side with Putin's principles and policies would not stand much of a chance with the public, particularly after the plethora of issues the country is now faced with following its invasion on Ukraine. History is itself witness to it. Shifts in power between those having the same political approach, particularly the ones with heavy reliance on the military aspect, a self-seeker attitude in terms of international relations, and so on, are very less likely to be the next successor. Putin has a certain aura around him, strong knowledge, and a political stronghold which helped maintain a balance with all the above-mentioned scenarios. That charisma is, well, a bit hard to achieve for most. Thus, any successor lacking any of the above would not be able to strike a chord with the Russian population. Question 9. Would the Ukraine war stop for the better? The war in Ukraine will only come to an end with the death of the Russian president. These were the words of Kiev's top military spy chief, Major General Kirill Budanov. The comments came amidst rumors that started surfacing over Putin's health. The president has been looking unwell in meetings, and some reports even suggest that he has undergone cancer treatments. Leaving him away to retreat is one of the strategies, but it is almost unrealistic, the chief said when asked about the possibilities of Putin surviving the war, adding, "He is a war criminal for the whole world. This is his end. He drove himself into a dead end. Don't worry, Ukraine will win." Well, even if Ukraine doesn't win ultimately, Putin's unexpected death, given the health issues he's already facing, will most likely put the war to an immediate end, as with all the instability and chaos following the president's death, there won't be as strong management of those forces, nor the required funds, which are extremely crucial for any war to keep going. Question 8. How would the mourning be like in the country? The death of the president and all the formal rituals post his death would all be televised. The public, as is obvious, would not take their eyes off the television. The mourning would keep the country quiet and still in its wake, and there would be a restraint on fireworks for some time. During the sad phase for the country, the Russian media would lose track and would probably focus on the possibilities and even conspiracy theories behind the death of their president. Russian classical music would be on sway on Russian TV channels, with Swan Lake dominating them all. After all post-death rituals are completed, a detailed assessment would gradually start replacing the classical music shows on television. Cities and important landmarks would be renamed after the president. Question 7. What would be the state of the economy? There will be no announcements in Russia for about 24 hours before the European stock market falls by 2% and that of Russia by 5%. The instability and lack of proper management in the country would result in a rise in the prices of oil. Russia exports large amounts of fuel and oil each year, so the prices of gas will skyrocket to unimaginable levels after Putin's death. Russia is also a large exporter of grains, iron, and precious metals, so the world needs to seriously consider how to maintain its supply chain after Vladimir's death. The market will continue to fall for a few more days, but if nothing terrible happens in Moscow, and if the state media proves the death to be natural, it will cut short most of the chaos, thus ensuring a smooth transition back to normality in the economy. Half of the loss would be recovered. Question 6. Would there arise a power vacuum? A vacuum of power would exist for long before yet another dictator takes charge. There have been instances in history when following the death of a dictator, the country sees some more autocrats taking up the vacuum, losing control because they could not fit the space created by their predecessor and are ultimately put off the throne. Thus, before yet another Putin takes charge of the country just the way Vladimir did, stability would appear rather uncertain and vague. Question 5. How intensively would Putin's death be investigated, and what would follow the outcome of the investigation? The death will be investigated thoroughly to confirm that it's not due to Western or Ukrainian special forces. If it turns out to be a Western special force, there would most likely be a nuclear war ensued against them. If it turns out to be a Ukrainian government special force, the war with Ukraine might get even uglier and more vicious. In a third scenario, if some other country is proven responsible, the country would be bombarded with nuclear weapons. Question 4. Are there any chances of Russia's collapse? Michael Rubin, an editor at Media House 1945, had famously put that Vladimir Putin has made himself a new kind of Russian Tsar. Here's the problem, he had said. While every democratic wakes up each morning knowing when his or her term will end, every dictator wakes up knowing that today could be his last, effectively encapsulating how life is for an autocrat. On the other hand, Vyacheslav Volodin, Putin's former deputy chief of staff, said in 2014 that there is no Russia today if there is no Putin. But it wasn't just the Russian government structure that Volodin was talking about. As many economists point out, Russia is a country of about 200 ethnicities. As those versed with geopolitics might be able to recollect, the Soviet Union collapsed primarily because it became so large to manage that it ultimately led to a shortage in money. All this might prove true for present-day Russia too, and the country's collapse might become possible following the president's sudden death. Question 3. Will there be a change of course for the country? Nikolai Bardashev is currently the Secretary of the State and might take over from Vladimir Putin if Prime Minister Mikhail doesn't. The two have had a great bond and also share the same political perspective. Therefore, if Putin dies and Nikolai takes over the charge, no significant policy change might come across. Question 2. How would the young generation react, and how would it change the course for the country's future? Young Russians have a deep hatred and disrespect for Putin. Over time, the younger Russian generation is expected to become more politically involved, radical, and sensible regarding their country's policies, and would naturally drive some great changes in the system. According to a study, Russian youth aged 16 to 26 is the group that can have some important influence on the country's future, while most people aged between 18 to 24 were adamant to leave the country, which emphatically shows that Russia is changing drastically. The youth of Russia would surely be sad about the death of such an important figure of their nation, but would soon find this an opportunity to transform their country's politics for the better. Question 1. Will there be a World War III in any case? In the event of Putin's death, World War III might simply not happen, or at least be delayed essentially for a while. However, if some non-Russian country is found to be involved, as mentioned previously, World War III would soon be in its full sway, ending with the deaths of millions. While for some, a situation involving Vladimir Putin seems an ideal situation for Russia and the world at large, it comes with its own set of financial and political issues. And while all of that seems a distant dream to come to reality, or more so something that can only happen in the parallel world, we'd wish the best for everyone, and Putin too. All of that while hoping that the Hitler of today gets some good peace of mind and starts channelizing the country's energy for the better, and essentially put an end to its war with Ukraine. And that's it. If you liked today's video, do consider giving us a thumbs up. Share the video with your friends and family, and go ahead and subscribe to our channel. Also, don't forget to hit the bell icon below. This way, you will always be notified whenever we come up with something fascinating and new. See you next time.